Thank you so much for the very kind introductions. The moral of this story is you must be very careful as to what you say to anybody you encounter, because 25 years later you might hear about it again when in a foreign country across the ocean. But I'm very grateful for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak to you here in the Miwon Lecture. Let me start with two apologies. The first is that I'm going to stick fairly closely to my written text in order to make the life of the translator easier. That I tend to be more spontaneous in my talks, but I will try to limit that today. The second apology is that I want to apologize for the title. It's kind of portentous and perhaps pretentious title for this lecture. I usually speak more modestly on narrower topics. But there are two reasons that I chose this title. First, I wanted a title that is worthy of the Miwon Lecture, Kyung Hee University, and my very distinguished former student, President Choue. Second, we meet today under quite serious and unusual historical circumstances. It now seems very clear 4 years on that the economic crisis that began in the U.S. with an economic slowdown in the fall of 2007 and that nearly destroyed the global economy in 2008, 2009, is continuing, and it represents the most serious crisis of global modernity since the 1930s. And I don't have to belabor this point. I mean, that just in the last few days, we know that the world economy has been on the brink again, that fears of a new recession in Europe and the United States are quite high. So that I have this slide which essentially shows how this recession in the United States, marked by the bottom red line, is different from all the other post-World War II recessions. Across the bottom, we have months since the peak employment in the last cycle. And this, on this axis, which got cut off on the slide, is the percent fall of employment since that last peak. And so you can see that this downturn has lasted much longer in terms of the slowness of economic recovery in terms of job creation. The U.S.'s economy is still way below the normal level of job production in an economic downturn. But in Europe as well, we know that the crisis of the Eurozone caused by the sovereign debt of countries like Greece, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, and Spain is very serious. And in Asia, even though your recovery has been much stronger in your country, in Japan, China, and Taiwan, given Asia's dependence on exports, its future is closely tied to what happens in Europe and the U.S. over the next few years. But I'm struck, given how serious and fundamental this crisis is, how serious thinking about how to pull the world economy out of crisis has been distinctly lacking. In my view, the source of the crisis is fundamentally similar to what happened in the 1930s, which is that the capacity of the global economy to produce goods and services now vastly exceeds demand as households, firms, and governments around the world are tightening their belts or limiting their purchases. And yet the only policy proposals that we hear are for more austerity policies, as though we could possibly solve a crisis of global oversupply by everybody consuming less. And at the present moment, as I said before, we could be heading into a second round of recession. Now, there are many factors that explain this lack of effective policy debate. Powerful interests and actors resist any kind of new thinking because they've made lots of money from the old ways of doing business. And the influence of market fundamentalism, the belief that self-regulating markets can solve all problems, inhibits political leaders from searching out new policy pathways. But I want to focus here on a third and less discussed barrier: the failure of the social sciences to provide us with the concepts that we need to find new policy directions. And this is not just a problem of economics, but of all the social sciences, including my own field, sociology. So my talk will proceed in four parts. In the first, I'll argue that the policies that helped us get out of the last crisis of global modernity, the one that occurred in the 1930s, required breaking out of a conceptual vocabulary that had dominated global policy debates. Second, I'll try to show how over the last 40 years we've become prisoners of a conceptual vocabulary that effectively blocks the ways out of the current crisis. Third, I'll explain why that conceptual vocabulary is misleading. And finally, I'll suggest some new policy directions. Let's start here with the crisis of the 1930s. Back then, the U.S. economy had made great productive advances in the 1920s. The result of those great productive advances was an economic boom that led ultimately to the stock market crash in October 1929. You can see the severity of that crash here. In the aftermath of that stock market crash, both the U.S. and the global economy slowed. There was no longer the demand to purchase output of highly productive factories. Right after the stock market crash, there was a period of paralysis quite similar to the current moment. In the U.S., our president at the time, Hoover, kept promising that prosperity was just around the corner as long as the federal government continued to pursue a balanced budget. The key reason for the paralysis was that almost everybody thought that there were only two ways to organize an economy. One was a system of private property, and the other was the path of socialism that the Soviet Union had embarked on after the Bolshevik Revolution. By the time of the 1930s, this binary choice, private property or socialism, had structured political and economic debates for 6 decades. This binary was paralyzing because on the one side, there was a great deal of fear by many that a leap into an entirely different set of arrangements, socialism, was terrifying. And on the other, the idea of private property was believed to entail a limited government role in the economy. So basically, the only policy option was to wait around for the business cycle to bring about a recovery. But what I want to stress is that there were a handful of thinkers and figures who worked their way out of the binary. The first were not attractive to us. The fascist leaders, men like Mussolini and Hitler, saw the possibility that you could link a private property economy with an all-powerful state justified by the necessity of destroying the left-wing enemies. In a word, they promised to protect private property by abandoning the tradition of freedom and liberty. And we know that that choice that they made had horrendous and unfortunate consequences. But there were also those who saw their way past the binary in a much more productive and positive way. One was the great English economist, John Maynard Keynes. He had been fighting against economic orthodoxy for close to 20 years, And he came to recognize that this binary of private property versus socialism was a false choice that obscured other policies that were possible. So by the end of the 1930s, Keynes showed his contempt for this binary by speaking of liberal socialism, a formula that he gave a strong anti-fascist edge. So I guess I should say it because so it'll be translated. So he said the question is whether we're prepared to move out of the 19th century laissez-faire state into an era of liberal socialism, by which I mean a system where we can act as an organized community for common purposes and to promote social and economic justice while respecting and protecting the individual, his freedom of choice, his faith, his mind and its expression, his enterprise and his property. So Keynes could not be clearer, especially in this quote, that the entrenched binary was the problem. The key political group that was a pioneer in seeing a way out of this binary were the Swedish Social Democrats. And I draw here on a book about the Swedish Social Democrats by Sherry Berman called The Primacy of Politics, that according to Berman, the leaders of the Swedish Social Democratic Party saw that orthodox socialism had come to a dead end because when the socialists got elected by parliament, they became cabinet ministers, their doctrine told them that there was nothing that they could do, that they just had to wait until the capitalism was overcome by socialism. The Swedish Social Democrats saw the possibility of a political strategy that used trade union militancy and the ballot box to overcome the inequalities and irrationalities of a private property economy. And so starting with key political breakthroughs in 1934, they pioneered the creation of the mixed economy or the modern welfare state. They borrowed the prestige of John Maynard Keynes, but the key point that Berman makes is that the Swedish Social Democrats really invented the European welfare state that other countries in Europe copied at the end of World War II, and much more of the world has copied ever since. So the point is that in the 1930s, effective government policy in the midst of a global depression required thinking outside of the established category system. And I'll skip forward a little bit here. The problem that I'm talking about in this next section is that we've forgotten all of this history. We meaning thinkers around the entire globe. I quote here from Tony Jute, the late historian, who said that many European countries have long practiced something resembling social democracy, but they've forgotten how to preach it. Social democrats today are defensive and apologetic, and he goes on. The point being that even social democrats themselves have forgotten the way in which they thought themselves out of this old binary. Now, there are a number of reasons for this amnesia that I'm talking about. And the one that I want to emphasize is the role of right-wing intellectuals in the U.S. And this story has an autobiographical element because it involves the New Left in the United States, of which I was a part. Basically, the story is that when I was of college age in the United States, back in the 1960s, the term capitalism was not used in polite discourse in the U.S. The preferred name for our economic order was a free enterprise economy. That was the official title. And the reason was because the Cold War was still raging at that time, And capitalism was the term of abuse that Soviet and Chinese communists used to denounce the U.S. for being a society with great inequality and great poverty and racism. And so people in polite society didn't talk about the U.S. as a capitalist society. In the New Left, we sought to break down this taboo because we essentially saw many things that we didn't like about American society, racism, the Vietnam War, and so on. And we thought that by linking these to the fundamental nature of ownership, that we were revealing what was truly going on. So we gave the label capitalism a new respectability, and New Left intellectuals, most prominent Emanuel Wallerstein, wrote about capitalism and gave the term a new kind of intellectual respectability. Well, right-wing intellectuals watched this, and they saw that there was a great opportunity. The key thinker here was Irving Kristol, who was often referred to as the father of neoconservatism in the U.S. And he wrote a book called Two Cheers for Capitalism. And essentially what Kristol realized is that conservatives, right-wing thinkers, could gain powerful political and ideological leverage by stealing the concept of capitalism that had always belonged to the political left. It was equivalent to what had happened in the civil rights movement in the U.S., where African Americans took the term black that had always been a term of stigma, and they said, black is beautiful. And so they turned the stigmatized term into something positive. Something similar has happened more recently with the gay movement. They took the term queer, which again connoted heavy stigma, and said, you know, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. That there's tremendous power in taking a negative term and making it a positive. And that's what Irving Kristol and his friends did. They took the negative term of capitalism and said, we're capitalists and we're proud of it. And in doing that, they reinvigorated conservative thought because they gave it a more systemic line of argument than it had been before. A lot of the old free market arguments emphasize voluntary choice, individual freedom, but by saying we're capitalists, this is a capitalist system, they could emphasize how little choice the society had, that you could only do those things which fit with capitalist institutions. So that this is the rhetoric that the right has used over the last 30 years in the US and to some degree in other countries to dismantle much of the welfare state. They say giving people, well, you had your own fight in Seoul over free lunches in schools, you know, that capitalism doesn't involve giving school children free lunches. It doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense. So these are the kind of arguments that that they used. So the familiar arguments: you can't tax rich people at a higher rate because it will not work to make capitalism work effectively. So over the course of my adult life, the term capitalism has been transformed from an oppositional term to the normal description of U.S. society by people on the left, people in the center, and people on the right. So this is a dramatic change. In 2009, some of the most conservative members of the U.S. House of Representatives put forward a proposed amendment to the U.S. Constitution that they called the Preserving Capitalism in America Amendment. And it was in response to the bailout of the U.S. auto industry. Their proposal would prohibit the government from owning stock in any company, because the U.S. government took stock in Chrysler and General Motors in exchange for giving them large loans that helped save them from being broken apart. So the point of all of this is that the old binary, the one that existed in the 1930s and restricted political and economic options, has now been recreated. And the choices are starkly capitalism or socialism. Nothing in between can be imagined, and we don't have, at this historical moment, figures of the stature of John Maynard Keynes arguing for liberal socialism or for something else that breaks apart that binary. Now, I know that speaking here on the Korean Peninsula and saying that the choice between capitalism and socialism is a false binary might sound a little strange, but I would recognize that there are very distinct and deep differences between North Korea and South Korea, but I would explain those at this point as the difference between democracy and dictatorship, that's more fundamental to the difference than the difference in economic system. But we can come back to that question later. So this is the reason why I think that since the economic crisis in 2007 and 2008, it's been so difficult for people to think their way out of the crisis. So let me turn now to the third section, which is what's the matter? Why do I see such problems with the concept of capitalism? Why do I think it's so misleading? The core problem is that the concept of capitalism carries with it the baggage that the economy should be an autonomous realm that's subject only to its own special laws. So this is the basis for the free market arguments that government shouldn't intervene in the operation of markets. I guess I have, that the term capitalism invokes this image of an autonomous economy, which is a kind of mechanism where you have these interlocking markets for products, for labor, for capital, and that this autonomous economy operates according to its own laws. Those are the laws that the economists tell us about. And it makes you think that the economy can't be directed, can't be shaped for human purposes. So in my own field, economic sociology, we've been trying to challenge this view of the autonomous economy with the idea of embedded markets, that markets exist within social relations, they're embedded within social relations, within politics, and that there's nothing, that the idea that markets and market processes are autonomous and operating on their own is deeply problematic, that markets require the social relations and the politics to work. I'll give you two examples. First, as Adam Smith recognized, markets are dependent on morality. If everyone is determined to profit at the expense of others by whatever means necessary, lying, cheating, stealing, trust will quickly evaporate and market activity will be replaced by confrontations among armed gangs. That was much of the problem with the attempt to bring about a rapid transition to capitalism in the former Soviet Union. They privatized quickly, but there was no legal order, no moral rules, and that instead of productive investment, you had theft and smuggling and kidnapping and criminal enterprises rather than what we think of as productive economic activity. And the second point I'll make here is that how can an economy be autonomous from the rest of society when it's completely dependent now on advances in science and technology? And those advances in science and technology proceed by an entirely different logic than utility maximization. So some of my own recent research has emphasized how important, even in the United States, or especially in the United States, how important the federal government's role has been in helping get new technologies out of the research laboratory into the commercial space. So what sense does it make to say that the government should stop intervening in the economy when it was government initiatives that produced such key technologies as the jet plane, the computer, the laser, solar panels, pharmaceuticals based on gene splicing, and thousands of other key breakthroughs? But the place where this notion of an autonomous economy is most troubling and problematic is in the relationship between democratic governance and market relations. The idea of an autonomous economy expressed in the concept of capitalism forces us to believe that there's a fundamental conflict between democracy and well-functioning markets. And this is the argument of contemporary free market thinkers. They're constantly telling us that the democratic will of the people cannot be trusted. So we see this today in the case of Greece, that the electorate in Greece, they wanted the government social programs, they wanted the generous pensions, they voted the politicians into office to give them those. And yet now the world community is telling them the logic of capitalism requires that you give up those things, that capitalist logic is supposed to trump democratic governance. But in the United States, free market theorists are very clear that they don't trust democracy. So, for example, they're constantly pushing for things like a balanced budget amendment to the U.S. Constitution so that the government could only engage in deficit spending if 2/3 of the members of the legislature voted for it. In other words, they don't trust majority rule. They want supermajorities required to pass things because of their distrust of democracy. But this way of thinking, and this is really, I think, my most fundamental point, is that the dynamism of modern economies, and this is true in the US, it's true in Korea, it's true everywhere, is that the dynamism of modern economies is rooted in the fact that they are democratic entities. And this is particularly obvious in the economic history of the United States. De Tocqueville's classic book about America, Democracy in America, he emphasizes that the contrast between the U.S. at that point, which was democratic, and France, which was still aristocratic and hierarchical. And he was essentially saying that in France, because of that hierarchy, you got crony capitalism. You got a system where the political leaders made deals with some of their friends, but that the political process wasn't open. And it's only it was in America where the political process was open that rising entrepreneurs could get some political leaders to support them, build the infrastructure they needed, give them the resources that they needed. So it was democratic institutions and ideology that finally allowed the U.S. to eliminate chattel slavery that had been a huge barrier to constructing a continental economy. And in the 19th century, farmers in the U.S. fought for government to create the laboratories and extension programs that made possible dramatic advances in agricultural output. Well, let me make one more point here, that coming up to the 20th and the 21st century, I would insist that democratic electorates essentially voted in the welfare state, health insurance, unemployment insurance, other kinds of social insurance, a strong public education system. And my argument is that rather than seeing those as drags on the economy, that those have been enormously productive. They explain much of the economic dynamism, because as we know, when you distribute resources and you raise the educational level of the population, it makes your firms more productive, more competitive in the global economy. So these welfare institutions have been extremely productive. So I'm arguing that it's important to understand that democracy and economic dynamism are not in tension, as the theorists of capitalism would insist, but that democracy is one of the key factors that produces the dynamic economies that we want to have. Now, obviously, China is an exception to this. They've made dramatic economic advances even under a continuing party dictatorship, but I think there's still a great question as to whether China will be able to innovate, to develop the new technologies of the 21st century. So the most productive aspect of democracy, well, I guess coming back to the text, that it's true that democratic voters in a democratic society often make mistakes. They're fooled by demagogues, that people get elected who make promises that they can't possibly keep. But the basic idea of democracy is that it's self-correcting, that if you voted for one buffoon or fool who can't deliver on his promises, at the next election you can vote that person out and get somebody else in. So Abraham Lincoln said the kind of key thing, which is that you can fool some of the people all of the time and all of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. So that's the critical feedback mechanism through which democratic governance over time provides the inputs needed for continuing economic advance. So let me turn to the last part, the way forward. To put it very simply, the Keynesian solution developed in the 1930s was to use the mechanism of government to put global demand on a rising trajectory. This happened through three mechanisms. First, government acted in ways that reduced the uncertainty for business enterprises so they could confidently invest in expanded capacity. Second, government worked to support and sustain consumer purchasing power through welfare policies by improving the bargaining power of employees and by providing people with greater access to credit. Finally, direct government demand also increased very significantly through the direct provision of services and through purchases from the private sector. As economies became increasingly post-industrial, marked by a decline in the percentage of the labor force involved in the direct production of goods, there was a further increase in the demand on public sector budgets, the need for more infrastructure, greater support for science and technology, for education, for healthcare, meant more public spending, and this required higher levels of taxation. But in many places, the public's willingness to pay higher taxes was limited, and concerns began to mount, intensified by the irrational fears that big government was inconsistent with capitalism, made people think that the further expansion of government was now unsustainable. This effort to limit the size of government was part of the backdrop of the 2008 financial crisis. In the US, the revolt against higher taxes began already 3 decades ago at the end of the 1970s, and it has been gathering steam ever since. It continues to be the fundamental issue in our politics and in the States. And even in Europe, the Maastricht Agreement in 1992 set community-wide limits on the amount of government debt and borrowing. So that, given that tax increases were unpopular there too, it further constrained any growth of government spending. So what the Bush administration did in the early years of the 2000s was they tried to stimulate the economy by making credit easier and easier. And that credit bubble led to the excessive mortgage lending, the predatory mortgage lending, and that was a big part of what led to the economic crisis. But even though too much credit was part of the cause of the crisis, I would still argue that a more careful and coordinated expansion of the global supply of credit represents the only credible way out of the current global economic situation where there's not enough demand to get the world's factories and workplaces moving again. So the concrete idea that I have that I wanted to put forward is that even if we assume that governments around the world can't do very much more in terms of increasing their spending to support global demand, there is a mechanism that would work to solve the problem, which is to create a series of new global funds that would float bonds in the global marketplace and then re-lend the money that they raise to finance worthy projects which made economic sense in countries throughout the world. So, the mechanism for doing this is not at all radical. It's something that's been done by the World Bank for more than 60 years already. What the World Bank does is it issues bonds in the global capital market and then relends the funds to worthy projects around the world. But neither the scale nor the track record of the World Bank provides a good model. The World Bank has been lending roughly $40 billion a year, and the problems with its environmental and governmental and its governance structures are well known. But what I'm arguing for is a new set of global institutions that would gradually ramp up so that they were not relending $40 billion a year, but over a period of time, they would get up to something like $1 trillion a year. So they would be essentially borrowing, well, the chairman of our Federal Reserve Bank in the U.S., Ben Bernanke, wrote a famous diagnosis of the global crisis in which he said the real problem was that there was a global savings glut, that people, particularly in Asia, in South Korea, in China, in Taiwan, in India were saving too much, and they were sending that excess savings to New York, and the bankers in New York, just couldn't resist the temptation to invest all that global savings glut in bad financial instruments like collateralized debt obligations and mortgage bonds. So Bernanke's argument was a kind of effort to shift the blame, that it wasn't the U.S.'s fault that the global economy nearly tanked. It was really the problem was that these Asian people were saving too much money. But the idea behind my proposal is that, yes, there is more global savings available than there is high-quality paper, securities, for that money to purchase. So that if you created this series of global funds, a global infrastructure fund, a global green energy fund, a global health and education fund, and they were to sell their bonds in the global marketplace and provide people with 3%, 4%, 5% interest, they could then re-lend those funds to financial intermediaries within countries who would lend that money again to small businesses, to NGOs, to nonprofits, to local governments, to corporations. Again, they would carefully monitor the loans. They would be loans for projects that would be able to pay back the money over the next 10 or 20 years. But the basic idea is that we know that there is an infinite amount of productive activity that this present world economy needs. We need to transition from carbon-based fuel to clean energy. So we need to replace all of the wood-burning stoves and oil and gas furnaces and generators with solar, wind, and this mechanism would help to accelerate that transition around the world. Moreover, if the creation of these lending funds were combined with the implementation of a global financial transaction tax, and I'm told that even Bill Gates has now endorsed the global financial transaction tax, which is designed to curb excess speculation in financial and foreign exchange markets. The revenues from that tax could be used to subsidize lending to the least developed nations and to high priority projects such as those that significantly reduce greenhouse gas production. But along with restoring global growth and addressing pressing environmental problem, this idea is also meant to highlight something that has been obscured by the socialism versus capitalism binary. Our prevailing models of society are highly centralized, with many people being heavily dependent either on giant corporations or large government agencies. But there is, throughout the world, an emergent alternative in which local communities and bottom-up development looms much larger as we find ways to combine advanced technologies with greater self-sufficiency at the local level and decentralized forms of entrepreneurialism. The funding mechanism that I've described is designed to accelerate that emergent alternative. The hope is that even for-profit financial institutions will gradually see that there are real opportunities in financing these local initiatives, these bottom-up initiatives that they have historically neglected. So this brings me to my conclusion. We're living through a very difficult historical moment, and I don't want to understate the dangers that we face. I mean, that if in fact the US and European economies slide into a new recession, it would be likely much worse than the last downturn, and it would very likely set off a devastating chain reaction of financial failures and crises. But so I also don't want to paint an overly rosy picture of a possible future that we can choose. But I do want to end by insisting that the major obstacle to an effective global reform project that would put the world back on a course towards sustainable prosperity is not the power of certain armies or the enormous wealth of various global oligarchs or corporations, but the shrinking of our collective imagination that results directly from this capitalism versus socialism binary. It will take an enormous amount of serious intellectual and political work to break out of that binary and to reinvigorate our collective imagination. But as they say, we have a world to win. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your insightful talk. I wanted to ask you, there are a couple of points in terms of the global economy that seem critical, but maybe I didn't hear in your talk. One is the massive increase in the global population and what its implications are for the world economy. You mentioned climate change a little bit, but there are some reasons to believe that issues of climate, whether or not you believe in climate change with a big C, that in terms of water resources and arable land, that there are some very serious problems and that maybe some of this is totally unprecedented. And then in addition, issue of information and the way in which goods are identified in terms of in the digital form. Money itself is becoming digitalized, and in fact, in a way, all of our values and perceptions have been profoundly transformed by this shift from analog to digital understanding of information. So I was curious, in those respects, might it be that we're actually encountering something which is completely unprecedented and actually quite different than the 1930s?
Right. Well, I didn't mean to suggest that that the crisis was the same as the 1930s, and I think you're absolutely right that adding the environmental, the climate change, and broader degradation of the global environment it adds a dimension that wasn't there in the 1930s, and that threatens our future as a species. But I guess so. I take seriously all of the issues that you raised, but I see that the possible solution again can't be simply restoring the global economy to where it was before the crisis. We can't do that. And this is a big part of the problem in the US that goes back to that first graph that I showed you. And it's actually one of the strengths of the Obama administration, which has hurt them very deeply politically, because in every previous U.S. recession, the first thing that's generally done is to essentially restore the housing market and allow purchase of housing to drive the economy forward. And the Obama administration recognized that they couldn't do that, that it didn't make sense to essentially start building more single-family homes in suburbs that model of urban and suburban growth had been exhausted in the U.S. And so they've essentially been allowing the housing market to remain pretty depressed, and they're essentially trying to shift investment away from housing towards things like clean energy. So there has to be a new foundation for that period of economic revival, and I'm actually more positive about some of the things that they've done in that direction than most people. But on a global level, that clean energy and sustainability has to be at the core of any global return from recession.
네, 강의 너무 잘 들었습니다. 네, 교수님께서 이분법으로 인한 상상력이 저하되는 것을 우려하셨는데요. 그런 면에서 중국식 사회주의가 주목받는 이유가 그거라고 생각을 합니다. 사유재산과 사회주의가 그러한 이분법적 경제 체제에서 이제 앞으로 미국 경제 위기가 계속 우려되고 있는 상황에서 중국식 사회주의는 어떤 역할을 할 수 있게 될지 교수님의 의견이 궁금합니다.
I was afraid somebody would ask me about China. Well, you know, that again, the Chinese case, it seems to me, reinforces my point about the limitations of the binary, because here you have Chinese socialism whose slogan is "getting rich is glorious." It's totally inconsistent with any tradition of socialism. I mean, it's really a party dictatorship which has changed its economic ideology without changing its label. I mean, I think that I think that China has to be a part of any globally negotiated agreements which make possible escaping from the economic downturn, and that the Chinese have a significant investment in that because they have to maintain their markets. The regime is very fearful of a rise in unemployment and the political consequences of that. But I guess I think that what I would argue for is a continuing engagement with the Chinese that continues to emphasize to them that they need to democratize their society. I had it in the talk and jumped past it, but that crash this summer of the high-speed trains seems to me a metaphor that the Chinese are trying to make this leap into the 21st century with these huge centralized investments in infrastructure, you know, and we're very envious in the US where, you know, reactionary politicians told Obama that they didn't want high-speed trains in their state. I mean, it was just craziness from any economic point of view, and here are the Chinese building thousands of miles of high-speed rail, but they're building it from the top down with no public openness, no public debate about where the lines go, and you know, so we see that crash as a kind of metaphor of what happens with a technocratic model of infrastructure building. It, by virtue of not being transparent, there's no way to protect you from the technological hubris, you know, that leads to the trains crashing, when the whole idea of high-speed trains is that they mustn't crash. I mean, that's.
교수님 강의 너무 잘 들었고요. 저는 아마 대학생이라서 지금 제 한국에서 가장 이슈화 되고 있는 대학교 등록금 문제를 얘기 안 할 수가 없는데요. 지금 저는 뭐 좌파나 우파는 그런 게 아니고 그냥 중도지만 한국의 보수주의자들은 무상급식이라든가 대학교 등록금 반값을 이제 국가의 부채라든가 세금을 많이 걷어야 된다는 이유로 반대를 하고 있는데 또 그런 와중에도 대기업 위주의 지원을 계속 하고 있거든요. 그래서 교수님 생각하시기에는 이런 한국에서의 복지에 관련해서 이러한 주요 정치 관계자들이 하는 행동에 대해서 어떻게 생각하시는지 궁금합니다.
Thank you for the question. I'm clearly not any kind of expert on Korea. I don't pretend, but I strongly believe that it's essential in all modern societies to facilitate access to higher education, and that means to reduce the economic barriers, which means that to keep the tuition at reasonable levels, to provide financial assistance for students who come from lower income backgrounds, that this is one of the most distressing aspects of the way the crisis is playing out in the United States, that in the US historically higher education served as a major mobility route that people could move up social classes by gaining access to higher education, but that's become much more difficult because in almost all of the states, the public higher education system has raised tuition and fees for the same reason, because taxpayers don't want to pay more taxes. And in my own state, California, because our population of prisoners has risen so rapidly, we now spend more on the prison system than we're spending on universities and colleges. So this is a route to economic decline when the higher education system becomes essentially a mechanism simply for perpetuating the existing class structure, where only children from higher income families can afford to go. So I can't stress how central it is to maintain that avenue of mobility. The whole idea of a model of economic growth based on decentralized local communities requires that the set of skills that are learned in higher education, both the technical skills of engineering and the organizational skills from the social sciences, that those be available to as many people as possible. So I'm a very strong advocate of public support for higher education.